I'm tired of my piles of scraps. They take up way too much room and they just get in the way of having a nice, clean, organized space. But I paid good money for all of this fabric and I just can't bring myself to throw any of it away. It's time to sort my piles and use these scraps to make my string quilt. I'll add some variety to my quilting, a way to use up my future scraps, plus I'll check a quilt off my bucket list. Finally, my scrap hoarding is going to pay off. Hi, I'm Julie. Welcome to Quilting Plus More, where we're all about bringing your quilts to life so they can be treasured for generations. If you're not familiar, a string quilt is made up of fabric scraps or strings that are left over from making quilt blocks. This extra material is then sewn together into blocks and the blocks sewn together to make a quilt top. And what makes this so great for using up scraps is that you virtually use all sizes, all colors and patterns of your fabric. It's very little planning per se. Grab a bag of scraps, your foundation blocks, and sew. For my first try at a string quilt, the only thing that I planned ahead is my star pattern, the star color, and the corner accent color. I originally wanted to use this fabric, but now I've decided to leave them in the foundation fabric. I'll leave this fabric for another day. Plus, I think using this fabric with all of these scraps, it would just get too busy. It feels really good to be getting this done. These pieces, yeah, I probably would use them in other projects, but at this point, they're going into the cause. All of this is in. Yay. And now look, I have more storage space so that I can get organized. So yay, progress. Now that's done, I need to decide on the type of foundation for my blocks. And I've decided to use up this fabric and mark my pattern on this foundation fabric with a water-soluble pen. I'm using a water-soluble pen because my marks will not be permanent and will come out with water. I can use the disappearing side of my pen if I'm using my foundation squares right away. The disappearing pen usually disappears within 24 hours. If you are using a water-soluble pen, remember to remove these marks prior to ironing or they will be permanent. You know, even though this is my marker of choice, I always test this on every piece of fabric before marking, just to be safe. I went ahead and extended my lines to my pattern well beyond my 5.5 inch unfinished square. And I did that because when I put the foundation block on here and go to set up my ruler, I was having a hard time seeing the line underneath here because of the shadow. And now by having those lines extended, I can see them easier and line up to those lines. And it just seems to be faster for me. You know, it's simpler, it's easier. I can do this when I'm watching TV or whatever as I'm, progressing in this process of making these string blocks. Now that's done, I want my strings all mixed up. If they are not mixed up well, then you'll end up with the same fabrics all bunched up into a few blocks, and they won't be spread throughout the blocks and the quilt. And the look, in my opinion, becomes kind of a blotchy look, and it's not random or as pretty. Some of these pieces are large, and so I am going to take some time in cutting these pieces down a little bit to manage a more manageable size. And I'm afraid that if I don't do it now, that I may end up with a lot of the same blocks. The one thing that I do want to make sure of is that I do leave some longer pieces, because I want to make sure that on my block I have long enough pieces for this line that is right next to the star. Okay, one last little toss. We are ready to sew. Now that my strings are all mixed up, I can start sewing using a 1/4 inch seam allowance when possible. But if I need to, I can go down to 1/8 of an inch. I am going to be chain piecing my blocks, and what that means is that I am going to sew one block, and then I'll take another block and I'll just keep sewing the sections until it's complete without breaking my thread. And you just keep doing this until your block is sewn. So now I'm at the point where I'm going to do my corner, and my corners are going to be the same color as my star, which is this foundation fabric. And so I have my scrap pieces, and I'm basically eyeballing this line on this side, and then I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to sew on that line. I'm just going to keep chain piecing these as well. And once this side is done, then I'll start the other side of my star. I kind of tried as I was sewing some of these to get them a variety of widths, just so I had not everything the same width and, you know, the same number of strings on each one. I really want the variation, and so I tried to, as I was sewing, just kind of keep that in mind. I am all ready to start the other side of my star. The one side is completely sewn. I've sewn my cornerstone on, trimmed back to 1/4 of an inch roughly, and finger pressed this over. And so now I'm ready to start on this side. And I am going to sew this other side of the star exactly like I sewed the first side. I am going to just chain piece it and trim to 1/4 of an inch and literally just keep going. Now that my strings are all sewn on, I need to square up my block because my strings are hanging all over my edges. I want my block to have a nice clean edge when I sew them together. This will ensure that not only is my block square, but my quilt top is square too. So I'm literally just doing 5.5 by 5.5 and cutting right along that edge. For me, when I was sewing and saw this, it was, you know, I'm not so sure I'm gonna like this, but once you get them trimmed up, it makes a big difference. So I guess where I'm going with this is just keep an open mind. And there we have it. Originally, I was going to finish this as a small quilt. I've decided to continue block making until this is a queen size quilt. I have my foundation blocks all cut, marked, and I've stored them in my string bin so that I am ready to sew whenever I want. And what is amazing to me is that there is all of this in this little block. I've used up a ton of scraps and cleaned up my area. I don't feel guilty about collecting future scraps and strings, and I've added some variety and fun to my quilting. Here's another way to use up those scraps using a variation of this star pattern. I'll see you there.